My name is Maria Coryell-Martin, and I'm the founder of Art Toolkit. Today, I invite you to join me in getting to know your palette. In this video, we'll cover tips for filling your pans with paint, labeling your pans, making a swatch card, and finally, sketching your palette and exploring some color mixes in your sketchbook. Once you've chosen the paints for your palette, here's how we suggest filling the pans and getting to know your colors. So I've got my paint tubes ready, as well as a towel and a small cup of water in case I need to wipe my fingers. So the first thing I usually do is to remove the pans from my palette. I prefer to fill them where I can hold them using my fingers and keep my palette clean. Okay, next I'll choose my colors. So for this palette, I've picked 3 primaries for some standard pans, and the rest will be in minis. I'm going to start with the standard pans. So I begin by holding the pan carefully by its side, and then I squeeze. And as I squeeze, I push up and down a little bit with the tube and sort of smush the paint into the corners. And then after I'm about done, I scrape the edge of the paint tube across the edge of the pan so I have a nice clean finish with the paint. Let's try another color. I also don't worry if I miss a spot a little bit because I prefer to do 2 fills with my paint pans. This allows them to dry overnight, and then I do a second fill because sometimes when they dry, there's little cracks that form and they shrink a bit. So that helps me really top them off with the 2 fills. So here with Cobalt Blue, I've done that same technique, smushing down, scraping the edge of the paint tube on the pan. Next, Quinacridone Rose. Starting from one side, smushing it into the corners, holding it carefully from the sides, pulling down, scraping it against the edge. And there we go. Just to show a couple of these colors in pans that have only had 1 fill. This is a little Quinacridone Rose. It's receded and you can see that there's some cracks. And here's that Hansa Yellow Medium. And that second fill will really help top it off. Moving on to the mini pans, and screw my paint tube, give it a squeeze. If you ever have a paint tube that's hard to open, sometimes I use pliers, but sometimes I'll run it under a little warm water under the tap because dried paint will sometimes make it difficult to open. And you'll notice different paints have different viscosities. Some are a little thicker or a little stringier. Here's Cobalt Teal Blue, which always feels a little thicker to me. And sometimes in paints you might see like a little gum arabic solution still a little separated from the paint. I usually just let those swirl together in the pan. Don't worry about it. Perylene Red. I love these mini pans for when you've just got those special colors you just need a small amount of paint for, just to play with. Rotate that around. There we go, and just a few more colors. Freshly filled palette just reminds me of like a little box of candy, colorful, and it's just so satisfying, but don't eat it. There we go. Almost finished. All right, I'm gonna let these dry overnight, do my next fill, and then I'll show you how I like to label my pans. So my pans are dry now, and I've had the chance to do 2 fills of paint on them, and you can see how nice and smooth they are. And now's the time that I like to label them to help me remember what the colors are. So here's a few things you can try. One is you can use a Sharpie pen. So you might write a little note, Hansa Yellow Medium or HYM. And this can work well for a little while. Sharpie pen can wear off with use. So another suggestion is to write the name on a little piece of paper, for example, HYM, and then go ahead and tape it to the bottom of your pan using something like packing tape, so it'll be pretty waterproof. So that's another technique you might try. Now, my favorite is to use my trusty label maker. So this is an old Brother T-Touch. It's almost 20 years old. It's really held up well. And I really like to use this just to type in the names of my pans and print them out and stick them to the base. So let's see here. We've got HYM. And if you use a shorthand like me, make sure you remember what they are. Then I'll have QR for Quin Rose. I'll use Cob for Cobalt. And let's start with those 3. There it is, kicking out the label. So satisfying. And I've got my teeny tiny scissors here. So I'll just trim these down and tape them to the backs of my pans. This label tape is just the perfect size. Sometimes it hangs over just a touch, but I just wrap it around. So I'm going to go ahead and do this for every color. After I've labeled my pans, I like to assemble my palettes, and then my next step is to make a little swatch card so I can help remember what I have in my palette. So it really gives me a nice visual that I can carry around with me. So I'll pop my colors in, and then my swatch card is going to be like my little road map. And these are really fun to make the same size as your palette. So if you've got a Demi, it's like 2 inches by 1.5 inches, or you can trace the little insert card that comes with it. Just give that a trace. All of our palettes come with one of these. So I've just cut a little piece of watercolor paper, and now I'm going to go ahead and match the colors in my palette to colors on my paper, and I'm going to approximate the same sizes, so help me remember the pans. And I'm going to work left to right so I don't smudge my paints. Try and get this nice and saturated, not too watery. And this little card will be something that I will tuck into my Art Toolkit next to my palette to give me that visual. You might enjoy on your swatch card varying the intensities of your colors a little bit. It's a little tool for you. I'm going to let these dry for a moment, and then I'm going to come back, turn it over, and add the paint names to help add one more reference to this little card. Okay, my little swatch card has dried, so I'm going to go ahead and note the color names on the back. So here I have a little NT, neutral tint, BT, trying to use the same abbreviations, or I can write them fully out. Now my swatch card is ready to go. One thing you can also do is add a little layer of packing tape around this, or laminate it if you have that tool, so it's a little more durable and waterproof. But again, this is something you can slip in with your palette to be a reference. And if you're someone who likes to rearrange your palette often, remember that these are really easy to make. Now that you've filled your pans, labeled them, created a little swatch card, there's one final fun step we recommend for getting to know your palette, and that is to sketch it. So a little shortcut for this is that you can just trace the outside of your palette nice and light, and you can keep these fast and fun. They don't need to be perfect, but it's such a fun way just to get to know your palette and start playing with the colors as a set. Practice, not perfection. And next, the pans. A little shortcut, if you want to kind of eyeball the spacing, is just to pull out a pan, just like you did with the palette. You can lightly trace a pan. Sometimes just getting one for a starting point helps me, just to think about making sure there's room for all of them. I love to fill these pages with my palettes with notes too. Maybe why I chose the palette, the date, anything else I've been thinking about. Often I have a new palette before a trip, maybe details about what I'm planning. And once I've got my loose palette, let's go ahead and add in the colors, similar to the swatch card, and start to bring that page to life. I love how color really brings even the simplest sketches to life. Just those light little washes of color. Remembering that if I don't want colors to bleed into each other, to leave just a little bit of space in between. And if they do bleed a little, no big deal. That's part of the magic of watercolor, is embracing the spontaneity and some of the uncertainty of putting paint on paper. For these colors to dry and add a few more touches of detail, but for a quick little sketch and starting to play with my palette, this is a terrific start. A friend of mine once said that a palette is like a portrait of an artist and each one is unique. Now that I've finished sketching my palette, I'm going to add a few color studies just to help explore some of the possibilities. So I'm going to start with some triads, and this palette has these lovely big standard pans. And triads can be explored with more traditional color wheels, or it's also fun just to add some little puddles of paint and do some more organic mixing, which I'm doing today. So there's my Hansa Yellow Medium and my Quinacridone Rose and Cobalt Blue. And with those puddles, I'll start to pull them together. If I want to see anything more intense, bring a little bit of another color in, add some intensity, and let them do their mixing on the page. And I'll come over and explore the rose and Hansa coming together, a little organic mixing. And let's see what kind of violets we get with these. Here we go. And then of course with a triad, it's fun to see what happens when all three colors mix together. You can do a little bit in the middle, or often I'll just pull out another puddle down below. Now the easiest way to explore neutrals out of a triad is to first mix an orangey color. So here I'm mixing together a little bit of my yellow and rose, get a nice orange, and now I'll pull in a blue and see what happens. And here I'm getting kind of a brownish gray. Oh, so fun. I could play with that if it looks a little green. Think of adding a little red. If it's a little too orange, add some more blue. There's so much to learn about color mixing through experimentation. Okay, so let's do another triad here. This time I'm going to try this sort of alternative triad with this palette. And here's a little raw sienna, puddle number one. Now we've got Perylene Red. Beautiful red. Finally, one of my favorite colors, Cobalt Teal Blue. And this one granulates as it settles on the page, creates really wonderful textures. So let's see what happens when they mix together. Bringing together a little blue and raw sienna. And remember, you can always heighten that intensity. Now, as I'm cleaning my brush in between colors, I'm giving it just a little wipe on a towel so I won't have too many big puddles of paint. Now let's see, I want to explore this red and blue a little more. I'll pull out a little extra patch. Ooh, I love that. Kind of a grayish purple. Maybe I want to see a little bit more of a green here. Sienna. Almost a little sagebrushy green happening. And finally, let's go for the three together. So once again, I'll mix a little bit of an orangey color. My rose, excuse me, my Perylene Red, raw sienna to make a nice orange. Now I'll bring in that Cobalt Blue. Oh, and I can start to see these brownish gray hues happening, which I just love. So now on my page, I've got this wonderful organic mixing happening on the paper that's really helping to show me some of the range of my palette. And of course, there's more. I could play with my green gold and buff titanium and neutral tint just to keep seeing how the different colors work together. But this is a wonderful start. Now, on any page, it's always a good idea to add notes. It makes the page so much more useful because you can go back and really remember what's going on. So I think the first thing I'll do is I'll just make a little reminder to myself of what these pans are. So I'm just going to list the mini pans, and I'll use the same shorthand that I have on my pans. So for that, I've got RS, and I'm just going across the top and then down the side. And then I used a little kind of pair, P, lowercase e, R. And then what's next? Cobalt Teal Blue, CBT, Green Gold, GG, Buff Titanium, BT, and finally, NT for neutral tint. And now under this, I'm going to add my standard pans. So I've got HYM, Hansa Yellow Medium, QR, Quinacridone Rose, and finally, Cobalt Blue, which I have as just a little COB. Okay, I have my labels for my pans and my puddles of paint mixes have dried now. So finally, I'm just going to add a header and title. And I find a title is one of those things that you add it to your sketches and it helps kind of formalize your page, remind you what we're doing, can make it really fun to look back on. So I'm just going to play around with a little art toolkit. And what is this? It's my new Demi. And a little note about what I'm doing, getting to know my palette. And finally, I'm going to initial it and add a little bit about the date. Now I think my page is ready, my palette is ready. So I'm going to tuck everything into my bag. Got my palette, my swatch card, and I'll carry this with my sketchbook everywhere I go. Thank you for joining me today. We hope you are inspired to get to know your palette for your adventures near and far. Please keep in touch. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments below, and we love seeing what you create.